Having a planning strategy is really important. Again, a cost that people don't necessarily want to take on board is the cost of a planning consultant. But a planning consultant can be a very, very sensible investment. They can unlock potential that you might not be able to unlock yourself. Do not assume that your architectural designer is a planning expert. That's a common mistake that people make. They assume that whoever's doing their design work is a planning expert. Now, there are plenty of architects and architectural designers out there who are also experts in planning, but it's not necessarily the case. And especially when you're dealing with a more complex application. So if you're dealing with something that's in the green belt, or if you're dealing with something in a conservation area or adjacent to a listed building, something that's going to be more sensitive, or if you're really pushing the boat out with your design and trying to produce something that is a little bit less conventional, then the help of a planning consultant can make all the difference and be a very, very wise investment. Do consider a pre-planning application. Again, I would take advice from your architectural designer and consultant as to whether this is worthwhile. In some instances, there is little benefit in putting a pre-application in, but if you do have the time in your program and you haven't already committed to necessarily buying it, a pre-app can be a good way of getting a good indication of what is likely to get planning permission, but bear in mind it's not binding. And if you're only going to get a junior inexperienced officer for that pre-app meeting, then the value of the information and advice you get may be fairly worthless. So take a view on it. It's something you have to pay for now. If you get the right person, it can be invaluable. If you get a junior officer who won't commit, it can be a pointless exercise, and you may be better off putting in a planning application and using that effectively as a pre-app, because you can always withdraw. An application in England is currently £578 for a single dwelling. That will vary in Wales, Ireland, and in Scotland. They're all devolved and can set their own planning fees. Typically, once an application is validated, it'll take 8 weeks to get a decision. Bear in mind, though, that the validation process itself can take some time. And so if you're in a hurry, you really need to make sure that you've satisfied every condition. So you can actually download what the validation requirements are for each local authority and make sure that you've included all of those requirements. And that way, once you get to the front of the queue, which is typically 2 or 3 weeks, your application will be validated and your application gets backdated to the day it was submitted. If you're missing information and your application isn't validated, you could find the clock starts from once your application is full and complete. Permissions last for 3 years. So even if you're looking at a plot that's got planning permission, do check out when it was granted and how long it's got left. You don't want to buy a plot where the planning has lapsed or is about to lapse. In most instances, providing planning hasn't changed, the local plan is still valid and the rules haven't changed and the NPPF hasn't changed, then there's a good chance you will get planning again on that piece of land. But in some instances, the planning could lapse and there can be a risk involved. So do check the duration of the planning permission. Be aware that existing planning permissions can be amended, but there's various ways of amending it through non-material alterations or material minor amendments under what's called Section 73. Bear in mind that they do not reset the clock. So you could have an application that's 2 years down the line. You could vary that to get a scheme that you want to support, and providing it's broadly the same as the existing consent, you might well get it through on Section 73, but it doesn't reset the clock for 3 years. You've only got the remaining period of the planning application. So that's a mistake you do not want to make. And remember that new permissions can run concurrently. So you could apply for a completely new scheme on the same piece of land. That does not overrule an existing permission. That will still run for the full 3-year period. Outline permission is an option where a piece of land doesn't come currently with planning permission, and you decide you're going to go for an outline consent to get permission in principle. It's less expensive and you don't have to provide the full design detail. It's not appropriate for all situations, but it can be a good way of getting a relatively low cost indication as to whether a plot is proceedable. If you're in a conservation area or a built up area, the likelihood is the planning authority are going to want to see the detail of what you're proposing, and that way you really don't have the option of an outline consent. Full planning permission, that's when you go in for detailed consent. So all of the information pertaining to the appearance of the building and other relevant information goes in at the same time. If you hear of a outline planning permission that has had its reserved matter submitted That's the detail you have to provide in order to be able to build a outline plan permission. You have to provide what are called reserve matters that'll be detailed on the outline consent. That information then becomes equivalent of a full planning permission or a detailed planning permission. If you hear those terms, they are effectively the same thing. Planning permission is not the end of the line. It doesn't mean just because you've got planning, you can start building. And this is a mistake a lot of people make. They do not look at the small print. They don't read the detail. Planning permissions typically have a whole list of conditions. Some of them are just fulfillment conditions, things you have to comply with, or compliance conditions. Others have to be dismissed and complied with prior to commencement. That will be detailed in the permission. Others have to be discharged prior to getting out of the ground. Do not breach planning conditions. It is part of the planning application. If you do, there's no guarantee you'll be able to discharge conditions later, and there is a risk you could actually invalidate your planning permission should the local authority take a very hard line. Section 106 contributions. This is something that are applied locally and will be detailed in the planning permission. So make sure if your planning application includes a 106 contribution, typically it'll be for affordable housing, you're aware of that and you're aware of the sum and that you budget for it. There could be a commuted sum payment. There can be a number of different contributions. It could be for infrastructure. It could be for affordable housing, as I mentioned earlier. Bear in mind that these are in addition to the community infrastructure levy, the CIL. Now, with CIL, there is an exemption for self-build, providing you assume liability, providing you then apply for the self-build exemption, and providing you then also issue a notice of commencement. If you miss any one of those steps, you can become liable for the CIL. If you miss the notice of commencement, you can certainly become liable for a fine. It could be a very big mistake that could prove extremely expensive. So look into the details and make sure you get your self-build exemption from CIL. As for the Section 106 contributions, as things stand, they could still apply. You are not automatically exempt as a self-builder. So if the planning permission has been granted with it, then you have to accept that. Since earlier this year, new housing has become subject to biodiversity net gain rules, and there can be very significant payments that have to be made. Now, there is an exemption for custom and self-build. So if you're buying a plot that has a BNG payment attached, you must make sure that you are going to get the exemption for custom and self-build. That might well mean varying the planning permission to ensure you aren't trapped in a very expensive BNG contribution.